What if I told you the snake-haired woman who could turn you to stone might actually have started life as a protective guardian? Welcome to Unboxd Origins. I'm Howie, your resident science geek and accidental trivia sponge.
And I'm Wyatt. I ask the big questions. Sometimes philosophical, often skeptical, always curious.
Today we're digging into how did the story of Medusa shape Greek mythology? We'll start at the artifacts. If you wander for a museum full of Greek things, pottery, shields, temple pediments, you'll spot a repeated face, sometimes terrifying, sometimes oddly beautiful. The Gorgoneion, the image of a Gorgon's head. Archaeologists trace these images back to at least the 8th century BCE in Greece, but the motifs may be older, sharing affinities with Near Eastern and Egyptian protective images. In early Greek literature, the Gorgons are named in Hesiod's Theogony. 3 sisters, Steno, Euryale, both immortal, and Medusa, the only mortal one. In Hesiod's chilly family tree, they're monstrous, born of the sea deities Phorcys and Ceto, themselves linked to older forces like Gaia and Pontus, a lineage that ties them to chthonic and marine dangers. Yet from the beginning, Medusa is an ambivalent figure. Her face is a weapon, a gaze that can petrify, but her image also functions as protection when affixed to temples, breastplates, and even doorways. So, we have the first big tension. Is Medusa a monster to be feared or a talisman to ward off fear? Next milestone, narrative evolution. By the time of classical drama and Roman poets, the story of Medusa shifts from cataloging monsters to a full-blown tragic episode. Ovid's Metamorphoses gives us one of the most famous versions, Medusa as a beautiful maiden violated by Poseidon in Athena's temple, and then punished by Athena for the desecration, transformed into the snake-haired Gorgon whose gaze turns men to stone. Ovid's telling reframes Medusa as a victim-turned-monster, and that twist radically changes how audiences read the tale. Suddenly, the Gorgoneion isn't just an image of danger, it's an image of injustice, of divine caprice, and of the complicated politics between male gods, female victims, and a goddess who enforces purity by turning that victim into a monster. This version also supplies the dramatic set piece that drains into other myths. Perseus, the polished shield of Athena, the winged sandals of Hermes, the grisly beheading, and the literary flourish that Pegasus and Chrysaor spring from Medusa's blood, a striking image of something creative born from violence.
Pause. Here's an aha I love, and I think it flips a lazy reading on its head. The name Medusa likely comes from the Greek root medo, meaning to protect or to rule, or a related sense of being mindful or a guardian. That's not a footnote, it's a clue. If you started with a guardian figure, a sort of protective mother whose face drives away evil, and then layered on heroic narratives where a man slays the guardian, the story's moral complexion changes. The terrifying face that turns onlookers to stone becomes a defensive icon when displayed. A curious paradox. The very gaze that petrifies becomes a protective motif when used as an image on shields and temples. So Medusa may well have been a protective spirit, an apotropaion, whose function was to deflect harm. Over time, patriarchal myth-telling recast her as an obstacle for a male hero to overcome. That's not just literary trivia. It tells us how myths migrate from ritual objects to narrative dramas, and how power intersects with storytelling.
Building on that, let's talk about Perseus and what the myth encodes about Greek values. The Perseus cycle, aided by Hermes and Athena, using a mirror-like polished shield to avoid direct gaze, is a masterclass in mediated vision and cunning. Perseus doesn't confront Medusa directly. He uses tools, allies, and trickery. That's a recurring theme in Greek heroics. Brains plus favor from the gods beat brute force. But it's also a story about boundaries. By beheading Medusa, Perseus severs a liminal creature, 1 foot in the world of gods and monsters, 1 foot in human affairs. And from her blood, something new erupts. Pegasus, a winged horse, and Chrysaor, a golden-sworded warrior. Violent birth as cosmic creativity. So the myth encodes multiple cultural scripts at once: the assertion of heroic dominance, the reproductive potency of violence, and the ambivalent role of female power, monstrous and generative simultaneously. The Perseus story further cements the Gorgon image in civic life. You'll find Medusa not just as a tale, but emblazoned on shields, armor, and civic architecture as both menace and defense.
There's another twist few people reflect on: the mechanics of fear in Greek culture. The Greeks loved doublings and reversals. The polished shield Perseus uses is, in effect, an early mirror tech, a mediated gaze. Instead of facing the monster with naked courage, he uses reflection to avoid the direct gaze. That is metaphoric. Knowledge, craft, and mediation overcome raw terror. It's like saying the right technology, whether it's a shield, a prayer, or a ritual, allows humans to handle the face of the divine or monstrous. And remember the apotropaic Medusa heads. Displaying a petrifying face to frighten off evil assumes that the image's power works in representation. So representation is powerful. It can protect or persecute. That's one reason Medusa persists. She's about how communities manage fear through images and rituals.
Now let's jump forward and look at Medusa's cultural afterlife. Once a figure is as visually potent as Medusa, artists and political actors keep picking up the icon. In vase painting and sculpture across the archaic and classical periods, the Gorgoneion morphs in style, sometimes grotesque and staring with bulging eyes and fangs, sometimes rendered with an almost sorrowful beauty. In later centuries, Renaissance and Baroque artists, Caravaggio is a famous example. Revisit Medusa as a study in horror and pathos. Fast forward to modernity. Medusa becomes a symbol for wildly different causes. Feminist reinterpretations reclaim her as a symbol of victimization and rage, a woman punished for being violated, while fashion brands like Versace appropriate her as an emblem of seductive, inescapable allure. That diversity of reuse demonstrates myth's flexibility. A single figure can be monstrous, protective, beautiful, victimized, and glamorous, all depending on who's telling the story and why.
And here's another aha that's deliciously modern. Think about the political uses of Medusa. In ancient times, the Gorgoneion offered protection, face to the enemies. But in modern times, Medusa has been reimagined as an emblem of warning against misogyny and as an icon of female rage. The same image that once kept evil away becomes an emblem to keep the status quo on alert. Political movements pick up mythic imagery because myths are sticky. They carry emotional freight across generations. So when artists and activists use Medusa today, they're not inventing new meaning so much as reweaving an old thread. A figure who embodies the power to freeze, to challenge, and to transform. That continuity tells us something about the deep human need for symbols that can both frighten and protect.
Let's bring that home with ritual evidence. The Gorgoneion appears in contexts intended for protection: temple gables, shields, breastplates, and even on the margins of funerary stelae. In a way, it's the ancient equivalent of a security system sticker in your window. This house is guarded, but the imagery also declares something else: that the world has dangerous thresholds. Medusa marks the place where order confronts chaos, the doorway between the city and the wild. Life and death. The mythic narrative of Perseus conquering Medusa gives people a story about how such thresholds are managed, through divine favor, craftsmanship, and ritualized violence. That story validates social structures, the hero as mediator, gods as arbiters, and certain genders as protectors or threats. Whether that's comforting or disturbing depends on your perspective, but it explains why the Medusa myth stuck so stubbornly.
And here's a final twist to chew on, which I find wonderfully paradoxical. Medusa's greatest cultural power might be her mutability. She's been a guardian, a monster, a violated woman, a badge of honor, a cautionary medal. That slipperiness is precisely why she shaped Greek mythology, and why Greek mythology keeps shaping culture back. Myths that can't be reinterpreted die out. Myths that bend and reflect new anxieties survive. Medusa bends beautifully. She can be a warning sign on a temple, a moral lesson in a classroom, or a feminist poster on a wall. The story's elasticity allows it to be a vehicle for social values, fears, and identities across centuries.
So what's the takeaway? Medusa's story shows how myths do double duty. They explain the world and they manage it. As a figure, she's both mechanism and metaphor. Mechanism in that her image works in practical ritual, protectors carved into wood and painted onto shields, and metaphor in that her narrative encapsulates Greek ideas about femininity, power, victimhood, and heroism. Her evolution from protective spirit to monstrous obstacle to be slain by a male hero reveals how myth can be reshaped by cultural agendas. But Medusa also gives back. The blood that births Perseus suggests creation can arise from destruction, and the fact that her iconography becomes apotropaic suggests monsters can be domesticated into guardians.
And why it matters beyond dusty classrooms, Medusa is a case study in how stories circulate and who gets to reframe them. If a community chooses to see a figure as protective, it becomes a symbol on shields and temples. If storytellers choose to cast the same figure as monstrous, it becomes a tale of conquest. Recognizing that helps us read our own myths, civic narratives, national myths, social norms, with a little more skepticism. Which narratives are protecting whom? Which are reviled because they stood in someone's way? Medusa asks us to notice how power molds meaning, and how images can both guard and silence. That's not just ancient history. It's a mirror for our present.
If you liked peeling back those layers with us, smash that like button, subscribe for more origin stories, and share this with someone who loves a good myth mashup.
So, if a snake-haired woman might have begun life as a protective guardian, what does that make our modern monsters?